getting into this subject after the break here. John Schaffer from Iced Earth. Many of you have written me about this and have messaged me about this and have been leaving random comments on past videos of where I've talked about John and his situation. But many of you want me to comment on the interview he just did with the lawyers that represented him in his January 6th lawsuit. And this is a subject I thought I pretty much had moved forward from because I made my opinion very clear. And I had a whole discussion panel about John and his situation. To refresh your memory, or if you are new to the show, I had a discussion panel I put together to talk about John and his situation in a very rational, civilized manner. And I wanted to have that because John had been pretty much excoriated by the media the entire time this lawsuit was going on, and the guy was getting his name run through the ringer. People were just piling on this dude for essentially what we found out later is that he walked into a building for 10 minutes, didn't harm anybody, got pepper sprayed and left. But I never said any, but the thing is, I want to make it very clear. I never wanted to comment on his situation until he was able to make a statement, which happened back in 2024, late 2024. He made that statement through his lawyers. But I didn't think it was fair to him to say anything until he actually spoke. So once that happened, then I wanted to make my opinion known. And I wanted to actually discuss what had happened with him and his situation. So things that came up in that discussion is what would his musical career look like if he decides to make music again. We discussed the situation, knowing what we know about the situation. We discussed, I ended up getting the court transcripts. Thank you, Metal Rose, from podcast of the Wicked. And essentially that discussion panel, which I'll put in the show notes, we came to the conclusion that John was a good guy, made a very, very poor decision, and he walked into a trap. And that's pretty much essentially it. That's probably the quickest, most blunt summary of that discussion. But the discussion was really, really well received by a lot of people. I also came to the conclusion that the people, his detractors, it's a very small amount. It's a small group of people that have a very loud voice. It's kind of like the squeaky wheel, at the supermarket on the shopping cart, right? You have, let's say you got 100 shopping carts in there. Each shopping cart has 4 wheels, and 2 of the 400 wheels in that supermarket make the most noise. Generally speaking, as I've said before, you have a small percentage of people that think John is a hero for what he did. You have a small percentage that, think he should be in prison the rest of his life. And then you have everybody else in the middle that is like, I'd love to see Iced Earth back. What happened. It's over with. And they've moved on from it. Now, why am I bringing him up again? And why am I bringing up this interview? That should be, that's obviously the next question many of you have. So he did an interview. The name of the channel is called Attorneys on Retainer. And the law firm that represented John, they specialize in self-defense cases. Now, interestingly enough, if you take the John Schaffer interview aside, the channel is actually very interesting because I am always fascinated by the legal process, crime documentaries, all sorts of stuff, and how things, happen in a courtroom, especially in regards to the cases that these guys deal with. And so I found the channel itself actually very interesting, and the lawyers that host the podcast, I find them very entertaining. They have a very fun personality, but they talk about many of the cases that they have, and clients that they've represented on there. So aside from the Schaffer interview, I suggest you check the channel out. It's an interesting channel, and I find these guys pretty entertaining, to be honest. They seem like very nice guys. Anyhow, getting back to the subject, John did this interview, and during a majority of this podcast, they do a step-by-step walkthrough of John's case. And there's some information in there that I thought was very interesting and I think should put to bed one of the biggest allegations that universally, whether people love John or hate John, kept bringing up in the comments. And that is the whole snitching allegation. Many of you, whether you love John and his music or you dislike the guy for, going to the protest, almost universally, everybody kept bringing up, oh my God, John's a rat. He snitched on people. He sold people out. And my defense to that, or my rebuttal was, well, yeah, he probably had, probably was threatened with decades in prison. And, it's easy for people to sit back and be like the armchair quarterback and say, well, yeah, he's a snitch and he's a sellout, but I guarantee you 99.9% of the people making that comment would also probably sell people out if they were faced with either 60 years in prison or, some probation. But we really didn't know the whole aspect of that because John alluded to the fact he didn't really know anything in the previous 2 interviews that he did. But people were still making the comment. Well, now, folks, we have clarification of what really happened with that. Folks, I want you to listen to this clip from the podcast, from the interview John just did. I want you to listen to this because the attorneys go into that whole, the whole plea deal of how they came to the plea deal and what they used as leverage for that. And this should put the snitching allegation to rest. Check out this clip.
Another interesting thing that happened in this case, which is because you were wearing that hat that said lifetime member of the Oath Keepers, the prosecutors assumed that you knew something that you didn't know. I guess in their mind, they kind of cooked up, oh, this guy must be one of the master planners of this whole thing. When, in fact, it was a piece of merch that you got, basically, for signing up with them.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I would have still been in trouble if I had a different hat on, but it would have been different.
That was the wrong hat to be wearing that day.
And you know what, dude? I brought 3 with me in my suitcase, and I just grabbed that one. One was like Devil's Tower, Wyoming, when we went there. Whatever. It was just, I just grabbed that one.
Isn't that interesting how much the wardrobe choice can make? It's
crazy.
But it actually turns out to be a good choice, right? Because they believed that you were more involved, and this gave us some leverage, right? So we went to the prosecutor. You want to talk about how that developed?
Yeah, and we kind of, admittedly might have teased that a little bit.
Maybe puffed it a little bit.
Yeah, puffed it up a little bit. Yeah, our guy might be willing to talk to you about what he knows, but, we want certain guarantees. And
right.
we need something in return and everything like that. And we were able to arrange this cooperation agreement where we brought in a couple of agents and some of the prosecutors. And John's required to tell the truth in such a meeting. Of course, by that time we've already kind of secured what we wanted to get out of it. And so John did just that during the cooperation. He told the truth, which is basically, I don't know anything about this organization, guys. I have a hat. I got some merchandise, and that's about all that I can contribute. Yep. But interestingly, and this turned out to be a really good piece of leverage for us as well, even though you didn't have any valuable information for the government about that, because that was kept secret and kept under wraps and kept as something that we couldn't talk about for years while all these other prosecutions were going on, there was a value to the government in having all the other members of the Oath Keepers think that you gave some sort of insider information. So we were actually able to, how we structured it, we were able to benefit from the fact that you participated in it, even though you weren't able to give anything valuable.
It's a little bit of inside baseball, right? Because you're thinking if you don't do this stuff for a living, you think, how does this stuff work? This is how it works, right? You essentially do this secret protected free talk that essentially says, I don't really know anything. They then seal it, and then they say, hey, John Schaffer is going to go out and take a plea, and he's going to talk about everything he knows, and they use that leverage to try to get other people to take a plea. From our point of view, this was very important to the judge on sentencing day. John Schaffer is going to be the very first guy in this entire prosecution to plead and own up and be a man and go into court and say, here's what I did, Judge, I'm going to plead guilty. And that was really very significant for the judge on sentencing day. And I think that, look, had we known there was going to be a pardon at the end of this, that, might have affected what we did here. But we didn't know there was going to be a pardon. And, our attitude as defense attorneys is we're getting our guy out. One way or another, we're going to get our guy. That's who we represent. We're getting our guy out, whatever it takes. And it's, it can... Making the sausage in a criminal defense case behind the scenes sometimes gets a little bit ugly back there.
Then here was my favorite part legally of everything that happened leading up to the sentence. The Federal Court of Appeals started reviewing the charges that the prosecutors were bringing against January 6 co-defendants and found that they had exceeded their authority in some of these charges.
Okay. So now you heard from John's lawyers and John himself how they came to the plea deal and that the snitching allegation is BS. So essentially, and again, folks, you have to remember that anytime you go into a courtroom, it's a very adversarial process. The lawyers want to win their case and they have to argue for their side. And the goal of these lawyers was to keep John out of the stockade, keep him out of the cage, right? And so what they did is they didn't tell the government or the prosecutors what he knew or what he didn't know. The lawyers let them think about that and stew on that and wonder, okay, what does this guy know? What does he not know? Now, obviously, John just went on a website and ended up getting some merchandise and happened to wear that Oath Keeper's hat. But the government and the prosecutors, they didn't know what he knew or what he didn't know. So the lawyers said, look, if you want to know what he knows, essentially what that clip says, you have to make a deal with us, which is very, very common, and when people practice law or, when you go to criminal court. So they used that as leverage. They wouldn't tell anybody. And it's funny when he says that we kind of let it out there that he might know something because they needed leverage to get what they wanted and needed for their client, which is let him out of jail, maybe get a reduced sentence. And so when they signed the deal, then John gets deposed and he really doesn't know anything because he wasn't really involved in the organization other than getting some merchandise. He wasn't involved in planning anything, or he wasn't involved closely with the organization as far as being affiliated with people that run it. He just happened to be a guy that had that hat on and they wanted to pin something on him. So they just, if you look at the court transcript, John's in there for 4 or 5 sentences. And they lumped him in with these people where they have pages of stuff that they are being charged with and what they did. So essentially they kind of exaggerated, not exaggerated, but they kind of put it out there that he might know something in order to gain leverage for John to get him a better plea deal. And that's what they did. So he really didn't know anything. He wasn't involved as far as running the Oath Keepers organization at all. He just liked what the mission statement said, got a hat, maybe a t-shirt, who knows. But that is the extent of it. So there really was no snitching. He didn't rat anybody out. He didn't snitch on anybody. And again, John is a blurb in that lawsuit compared to other people that were there that have this whole paragraphs of things that they did or allegedly did. And that is really the extent of it, folks. So I think we could put the whole snitching allegation to rest. Now, I know some of you out there are going to be like, oh, I don't care. He probably did say something and we don't know. You're going to think what you want to think. It is what it is. But the guy really, honestly, truthfully, probably, he didn't know anything. I mean, that's what it is. So there you go, folks. That's the one aspect I wanted to touch on. It's the one comment many of you kept making and kept writing me about. But John didn't rat anybody out. I mean, they just kind of gave the impression that he might know something to get a better plea deal. Brilliant strategy by by the attorneys that represented him, by the way, because not everybody that was involved with that ended up being as lucky as John and being represented in the way that he was. One other aspect before I get into the next subject here, I think in that interview they talked about a possible Sons of Liberty reissue. I believe that's what I heard a blurb of. Folks, I think I would, well, not just Sons of Liberty. I'd love to see more Iced Earth reissues. That back catalog is very, very good. I'd love to see some vinyl variant reissues again. Maybe if there's a live album or something else out there, merchandise wise, I think it would be really cool to have that stuff reissued, even if John isn't currently making music, or maybe let's say if he never does music again, it would be cool to have that stuff out there still, because Iced Earth was a very big band. For me too, a very big band, especially in the very beginning, 27 years ago when I started the show. So I'd love to see more of that. But the Sons of Liberty reissue, I think, really is something that needs to happen. And I say that because when that album came out many years ago, the subject matter that John was singing and writing about, these were subjects that people just didn't talk about or didn't know anything about. And the impact of it was, you have a few people that realize and have woken up to what really goes on in the world. But generally speaking, most of what he was writing about on that album, most people were just unaware of a lot of that stuff. I think in the last 4 years now, a lot of those subjects John sings about and talks about are things that are openly being discussed. Because now we are in the age of podcasts, right? We're in the age of the alternative media. The trust in mainstream media by everybody has been going down over the last 4, 5, 6 years. It's dropped dramatically. And that's not just, when I say mainstream, I'm talking like CNN, Fox, those kind of outlets. The trust in those outlets has plummeted. It really has. And now you have alternative media who are talking about a lot of the very same things John was writing and singing about back in, 2010, 2011, back, years ago now. Interestingly enough, some of the material that Dave Mustaine put out with Megadeth talked about a lot of these same sort of subjects. And back then, people just really weren't aware of it. People weren't talking about it. But now, many of these topics are being openly discussed. You have Badlands Media. You have Valuetainment. I've seen people bring it up on, Patrick Bet-David's podcast, before. Tucker Carlson touches on some of it now. Pretty big name, obviously. So you have a lot of these media outlets that are openly discussing a lot of this. Chris Williamson. There's just tons of podcasts out there that are just Chris Paul from, his show, Devolution, the Devolution Power Hour. So you have a lot of these podcasts openly discussing this stuff. And I feel now that the Sons of Liberty album and EP would really have a much bigger impact now, reissuing it and putting that out there now than it did back when it came out, because now more and more people are becoming aware of a lot of these things. If you ever go to John Schaffer's first interview he did, since the whole incident happened, it was with, I believe, a member of his church. There are a list of books in the show notes. Now, I've read about 95% of the books that are in there. There are things that I've read that aren't in there that people should read. But there's a list of subject matter there that's really eye-opening if you go and listen, if you go and read it. Some of those books listed in there, I've bought a few of them. I haven't ended up getting to them, but there were a couple in there that had been recommended to me as well in the past elsewhere. I had not really ended up getting around to reading them, but now I have been doing that. And that is, of course, stuff you should really explore. It doesn't matter what your political views are. It doesn't matter if you're right winger, left winger, centrist, whatever. If you have an open mind, check that stuff out. And that's really what it's about. So I think that album needs a reissue. I'd love to have it on vinyl. I would love to have like a CD remastered reissue of it. Maybe songs that John never put out. Maybe there is something in the archives that he may or may not have done. Maybe some bonus tracks if he has them sitting around. I think it would be really cool if he did that. And I think that album would have more of an impact now than when it was released. So I hope that does it. I hope we can now drop this subject again, because again, I've moved forward from it. Iced Earth is a band that really had a tremendously positive impact on myself, especially when I was really young, 27 years ago, and this show started out. I had that interview with Matt Barlow where I talked to him about that. But I hope this is the last time we talk about it, unless down the road John or something comes on my show. Maybe, who knows if that happens, if it happened just by chance, or, if I, talk to another member or former member of Iced Earth. But for the most part, it's a subject that I've moved forward from. But I did want to bring up that aspect about the quote, snitching that many of you have brought up. And I think it needed to be brought to light that obviously he really didn't sell anybody out or rat anybody out, because he didn't know anything to begin with. Hey everybody, Tony here from the Metal Command podcast. Again, I appreciate your support. Since 1998, I have hosted this show in one form or another, starting off in radio and now in the podcast format. Again, thanks for watching. And if you like what you see and hear on this show, by all means, please hit the subscribe button, hit the little bell to be notified anytime I do post a video. And if you see this program on any other form of social media, please give me a follow there. Again, I always appreciate your support.